Hello, everyone. I'm Mirka Moreno, an engagement producer here at the 19th, the nation's first nonprofit newsroom at the intersection of gender, politics, and policy. Our goal is to empower those we serve with information, resources, and community they need to be equal participants in our democracy. We're talking about the state of farm work and the policies around it here in the United States today. This two-part conversation will center the discussion around women, LGBTQ plus people, and children working in the industry. While they make up a minority of farm workers, they have complex and ever-changing needs in the field and face a unique set of challenges. We'll also talk about how parts of the agriculture industry are working to become more ethical and sustainable while working alongside the farm workers to make those changes. Consumers can learn from the experts about the people who grow and cultivate our food. So thank you for joining us today, and a special thank you to our partner in this conversation, Univision. First, I'm delighted to speak to three leaders at the forefront of worker rights and labor policies. I'm joined by Monica Ramirez, who is the founder and president of Justice for Migrant Women, Victoria Wankudu, who is a grassroots organizer at Student Action with Farmworkers, and Lupe Gonzalo, who is senior staff at the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. Hi, welcome everyone. So thank you. I'm very excited to be talking to y'all today. First, I'd really love if you could introduce yourself and say a little bit about how you became involved with farm work and agriculture work in general, and how that led you to the work that you do today. Just feel free to say a little bit about who you are and the work that you're doing. Monica, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Hi, thank you so much for the opportunity. So I am the founder of Justice for Migrant Women, as was said earlier, and I started working with the farm worker community because I'm part of the community. My parents were farm workers. My grandparents were farm workers. I was born and raised in Ohio, which is where I live today.
Victoria, would you like to go next?
Sure. So my name is Victoria Wankudu, and like Mirka said, I work at Student Action with Farm Workers, which is based in Durham, North Carolina. Unlike Monica, I do not come from a farm worker family. I did not know anything about farm workers until college. And the way that I found out actually about farm workers and the agricultural industry was that I did a summer internship with the organization I currently work for, which is called Student Action with Farm Workers again. And this summer internship, we've been running it for over 30 years, and it's all about getting young people involved in the farm worker justice movement. And so when I applied for the internship and I got accepted, it was during orientation that I learned all of these facts about these workers, all of the injustices that they face, this whole resistance movement that I knew absolutely nothing about. So that is how I ended up learning about the farm worker justice movement. And I finished college and I was working in Atlanta when this job opened up to be the grassroots organizer. And I was still really passionate about workers' rights. I still really wanted to learn more. So I applied and now I'm here. And that's my story.
Thank you so much for sharing. Lupe?
Hola, mi nombre es Lupe Gonzalo, soy parte de la coalición de trabajadores Immokalee. Yo vengo de las labores, yo trabajé 12 años trabajando en la industria agrícola, mayormente cosechando tomates, y me involucré con la coalición después de que se empezó a implementar el programa por comida justa, donde por primera vez, más de una década, escuché de mis derechos, especialmente mis derechos como mujer sobre el acoso sexual, y fue por eso que yo empecé a participar más con la coalición y aquí estoy, 11 años después.
You all kind of touched on how you became involved with farm work, and I think what really stood out to me is that it's all so different, and I think this is true for all of farm work. It exists nationally in different pockets, and it's very, very different everywhere. For example, I grew up working in the cornfields in the Midwest, which is very different from working the tomatoes, which is very different from picking strawberries and blueberries and all of that. So I kind of want to help illustrate that a bit for our audience. And I'm wondering if you can speak to what the communities you work with look like and what kind of work they do. What's their everyday like, and just what are their lives like in general? Lupe, why don't we start with you?
Sí, pues en Immokalee, nosotros estamos en Immokalee, Florida. Es un pueblo mayormente de trabajadores agrícolas que vienen de diferentes países como México, Guatemala, algunos países de Centroamérica y de Haití. Y pues un día típico de un trabajador es levantarse muy temprano, como las 4:30 de la mañana para empezar a alistarse para salir hacia los campos. Los trabajadores viajan en buses, como los buses escolares, hacia las labores de tomate. Y pues cuando uno llega a las labores, pues la única herramienta que uno tiene es una cubeta, que uno tiene que recoger los tomates, llenar esas cubetas y caminar como entre 100 pies para poder tirar la cubeta hacia un camión. Y ese es el trabajo que día a día uno hace como trabajadores. Y pues mayoría en la industria agrícola antes era 90% hombres, ¿verdad? Y muy pocas mujeres que trabajamos en las labores. Entonces eso hace bastante difícil, ¿verdad? Pero uno tiene que trabajar porque pues hay una familia que uno tiene que alimentar y los sueldos de los trabajadores realmente son muy bajos. Entonces, es una comunidad pues que también cuando pasan todo el día trabajando, regresan a sus casas y siempre está pues ahí esperando a la familia, pero muchas veces con el esfuerzo, el cansancio, el sol, pues a veces ya no hay ese tiempo para poder pasar con la familia, para poder ayudar a los hijos. Entonces, siempre es difícil ser un trabajador agrícola y tener familia aquí porque casi el trabajo toma bastante de la energía y ya no hay para poder compartir a veces con los hijos. Especialmente pues cuando uno enfrenta situaciones de abuso, ¿no? Para nosotras como mujeres, enfrentar el acoso sexual, que era algo que se había convertido como en el pan de cada día, eso hace más complicado la vida de una mujer, porque enfrentar el acoso sexual, saber que día a día que vas a ir a trabajar, pues estás expuesto a esos peligros, a esos riesgos, entonces es bastante difícil para uno.
Thank you for sharing. Victoria, would you like to join in?
Sure. I think Lupe did a fantastic job, honestly. I feel like I don't have much to add to what she said. I can talk a little bit, expand a little bit about the demographics of farm workers here in North Carolina, which is where I live. So in North Carolina, just like Lupe was saying down in Florida, there's a lot of the similar types of populations. The majority of the farm workers here in North Carolina are also from Mexico and Central America, especially Mexico is where the majority of our farm workers come from here in North Carolina. However, we do have a history and still a current population of farm workers who come and do H2A work who are from Haiti. That's been a very prevalent thing in North Carolina. And as well as in North Carolina, we also have like populations of Hmong immigrants, Asian Hmong immigrants who do work in poultry plants. One thing about SAF is we kind of have an expanded definition of farm work. And so we don't just think about field workers, even though we definitely think about field workers. We also include people who work in poultry plants. We also include people who work on like hog farms, for example, and things like that. So, and speaking of hog farms, there's also a big traditionally African-American industry of hog farming here in North Carolina. And we also consider those people to be farm workers. So we really do see a kind of big demographic spread, although I would say the majority of the field workers here in North Carolina are of Mexican descent. And yeah, I think Lupe did a great job describing what it's like to be a field worker, and I don't have anything to add to that.
Monica, what about you? Do you have anything to add? Or
yeah, I think just to share a little bit about some of the farm workers in Ohio. So interestingly, a lot of farm worker families used to come from Florida, from places like Immokalee and Plant City, and also from the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. And so whole families would migrate to where we are. And so we have migrant camps throughout the state of Ohio. About 30,000 farm workers come here. And I would say one of the biggest changes, and that's actually how my family arrived here, working in the fields as a family unit. But one of the big changes that has happened over time is that we see fewer families traveling here, in large part because of some immigration raids that happened in Ohio over the past few years. And there's a lot more reliance on guest workers. And those guest workers are almost all men. A very small percentage of them are women. There are seasonal farm workers here, meaning people who live in, small rural communities throughout the state of Ohio year round who are working the seasonal crops. So here where we are, there's a lot of bell pepper, strawberry, There's apples. There's a whole range of different crops that are being picked throughout the state of Ohio. Sugar beets, a big crop here. And so as things have changed, we see seasonal workers who continue to do a lot of that work, particularly into the fall. And then we see more of the guest workers who are here now on, 10-month contracts. So when Lupe was talking about the difficulties with having to work all day and, being exhausted and having to come home still to provide for our families, what we're seeing happening here in Ohio is that there are guest workers, men and women, and what they're talking to us about is how difficult it is for them to be away from their families, sometimes for 10 months out of the year, 11 months out of the year. And of course, certainly for undocumented farm workers who are not able to travel back home to be with their families, there's a real emotional toll. So there's the toll of the work and the difficulty for folks to endure the work and the difficult circumstances under the sun and with the heavy machinery and the dangerous conditions. But I think one of the things people aren't talking about enough is the emotional and mental toll of doing the work, which is certainly something that people have always struggled with. But I think that these long distances and all the different trauma that people are experiencing working in the fields, that's certainly something I think that all of us need to continue to elevate.
Yes, of course. And going off of what you just said, Monica, I think another thing that is so vastly different for farm workers is the issues that they face, right? Like depending on the kind of crops that they work on or, the factories that they work in, but also the states, the cities, and all of that. I think, very famously, Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez, and Philip Veracruz had led a very big movement in California that they were able to make big changes in California, but the same isn't true in other states. So I'm wondering, what are the ongoing challenges that farm workers face today, despite the, the big movements that we might have seen in history, but that aren't really well known today? And how are farm workers and organizers as well striving for change? Victoria, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mirka, for that question. I think there's so many things, unfortunately. I'll focus on two kind of things. So there's this concept of farm worker exceptionalism, which is like a really big word, perhaps unnecessarily big, but it basically means that farm workers are excluded from some of the basic labor protections and rights that many other workers get in the country. Sorry, there's a car horn going off in the background. But for example, farm workers are still not guaranteed a minimum wage. Farm workers are still not guaranteed overtime pay when that is a guarantee for many other workers. Farm workers are still not guaranteed protection when joining a union, which is like foundational. If you think about workers' rights, that it should be a foundational right that you can organize with people for better rights. And the fact that trying to do that could get you fired or blacklisted, and there's very little recourse for that legally, is really horrendous, honestly. So you think about minimum wage, you think about overtime pay, protection when joining a union. Child labor is still legal. And I know that's also a complicated concept because people do not, send their children to work if they don't need that income. So it's also tied to the lack of guaranteed minimum wage and wage theft and all of these other things. And I think another very big thing that I think Monica was getting to a little bit is lots of farm workers are undocumented. Definitely not all, but a big percentage of the population. And the way that our immigration system is enforced, if you will, is usually very cruel and very fear-inducing. And lots of the sites for targeting happens at the workplace. And that creates a lot of very well-founded and justified fear. And then if you don't have all these other rights that every worker should have on top of that, that just makes it harder to progress. But very fortunately, because farm workers and people in general are resilient and they push against control, there's so many groups who are fighting for better rights despite or in spite of all of these things, from many different angles. And I'm sure Lupe could talk a lot about this because she works with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is like famous worldwide now for their efforts, which is really awesome. Here in North Carolina, we have a union for farm workers called Flock that has also done some really amazing work. I don't want to take Lupe's spotlight away by talking about her work when I'm sure she can talk about her work way better than I could talk about her work. Staff is a huge support. And also Monica, Justice for Migrant Women, huge support. Anyways, here in North Carolina, we have a union called Flock, and they have done some really awesome work with boycotts. There was an olive boycott for a very long time. They are also doing these like tobacco boycotts against Reynolds Tobacco, trying to force Reynolds Tobacco to negotiate with the workers who pick the tobacco, because tobacco is a really big crop here in North Carolina. And just working on lots of things like forced meal plans, making sure that workers have access, to their own ability to make their own meals. Things like that are just really important. And one of the great things about Flock's work historically and in the present is that it's very worker-led and worker-oriented and very focused on empowering workers. There's also a subset of Flock now called It's Our Future that is even extra focused on empowering workers and extra worker-led. And so that's really awesome to see that here in North Carolina, in the Deep South, that there are these groups that are workers themselves speaking up for their own rights, which is the absolute best way, So I'm just really happy to be able to highlight that a little bit.
Thank you. Lupe, would you like to share your experience?
Sí, bueno, aquí en Immokalee, como trabajadores nos organizamos igual para poder combatir estos abusos, como se mencionó. Desde el 2001 se empezó la campaña por comida justa. Antes de eso, los trabajadores habían organizado mucho aquí en la comunidad, haciendo paros laborales, marcha contra la violencia, una huelga de hambre, todo para poder traer a los rancheros a la mesa del diálogo para poder trabajar juntos y eliminar los abusos que uno enfrentaba como trabajador. Entonces, ya que los rancheros no llegaron a ningún acuerdo con los trabajadores, empezamos a enfocar directamente a las corporaciones, los que compran los tomates que nosotros cosechamos cada día, porque nos dimos cuenta como trabajadores que las frutas y vegetales que uno cosecha no se quedan en el pueblo, se van a los supermercados, se van a la gente que lo consume cada día. Entonces empezamos a enfocar en estas grandes corporaciones que tienen el poder y hacer que ellos se muevan para que los trabajadores tengamos protecciones de derechos humanos. Entonces, lo que nosotros estábamos pidiendo cuando se empezó la campaña es que se pagara 1 centavo más por cada libra de tomate que se compra y que ese dinero vaya directamente al bolsillo de los trabajadores. También que firmaran un código de conducta que fue creado por nosotros mismos los trabajadores, en las cuales estábamos pidiendo derechos básicos como tener agua en la labor, descansos, que hubiera 0 tolerancia para el acoso y asalto sexual y 0 tolerancia para la esclavitud moderna, que eran los casos más extremos que los trabajadores se habían enfrentado dentro de la industria. Entonces, se empezó esa campaña, pero a la vez también empezamos a concientizar a los consumidores, que los consumidores supieran de dónde vienen sus productos, qué son las condiciones que un trabajador enfrenta para poder llevar esos alimentos a su mesa y cómo ellos también podían usar su poder de consumidor para exigir que las corporaciones firmaran estos acuerdos con los trabajadores. Entonces, básicamente, concientizar al consumidor porque las corporaciones no lo hacen. Las corporaciones simplemente muestran buen producto, buena calidad, pero nunca muestran qué hay detrás de la marca, qué son los abusos que los trabajadores sufrimos. Entonces, sí, hubieron y siguen habiendo muchos desafíos, como lo que se mencionó antes. Hay mucho miedo, claro que sí, que los trabajadores tenían miedo de salir del trabajo porque pensaban que iban a perder su trabajo, pero también tomaron la decisión y decir, pues, o sigo callándome o alzo mi voz para que haya derechos. Entonces, con el apoyo de los consumidores, estudiantes, líderes de fe, gente de diferentes organizaciones que apoyaron la lucha de la coalición, hemos traído 14 corporaciones que ahora han firmado ese acuerdo. Y ese miedo que los trabajadores por años estábamos sintiendo, por fin se terminó, porque no estábamos solos, no estábamos luchando solos, siempre había más gente que estaban marchando al lado de nosotros y eso nos daba a nosotros ánimos para poder seguir trayendo corporaciones también se trajo al 90% de los rancheros que producen tomate en el estado de la Florida, que ahora pues ya tenemos acuerdos. Entonces sí han habido muchos desafíos, pero a la vez han habido mucho más cambios que los mismos desafíos que los trabajadores enfrentábamos. Entonces ahora como trabajadores tenemos una voz en nuestro lugar de trabajo. Podemos reportar el acoso sexual sin miedo a ser despedidos. Se han prevenido muchos abusos con el programa de comida justa. Entonces, sí hemos logrado cambios y no solamente aquí en la Florida, sino que también seguimos expandiendo el programa.
Thank you, Lupe. Monica, I want to pose the same question to you, but also ask how those, for example, the issues that Victoria and Lupe have brought up, how those compare or differ from what women in the field are experiencing.
So I just want to say thank you. Lupe is a hero in our community, and so are all the workers who are working so hard alongside her. So I just wanted to say that because I feel really honored to be able to share this space with you today, Lupe. So, you know, my work has been focused on the rights of farm worker women now for many years. It's actually the 20th anniversary of the first project that I created this year, which seems like a long time ago. And the reality is that, as Lupe has said, and as Victoria has said, that farm worker women, you know, unfortunately are still experiencing widespread sexual harassment. There's still unequal pay for farm worker women. There's pregnancy discrimination. There's exposure to harmful pesticides that's resulting in many different issues, including problems with their reproductive health. You know, there are miscarriages that are occurring, children that are born. A very famous case that many people knew about around the world was the case involving Carlitos, which was a case, I think Lupe and Coalition of Immokalee Workers and others in Florida were all supporting the women who came forward in that case, Carlitos case, involving children who were born without limbs and birth deformities because, you know, because there was exposure to chemicals in the fields and to pesticides. Like, that was the crux of the case. So there are many of those issues that persist. And as Victoria has said, and as Lupe has said, there's a lot of organizing that's happening to stop those problems from occurring. And in our work, specifically at Justice for Migrant Women, we focused on a few areas: policy, trying to change the law so that farm workers at the national level, but also farm workers at the state level, have more of the rights and protections that farm workers should have always had, should never have been excluded from. The narrative work, telling the stories of the powerful leaders, people who are changing things on the ground, from amazing organizers like Lupe and those who are organizing alongside her, but also other workers who are courageously coming forward to take action. So we've spent a lot of time creating narrative projects like Phenomenal Farm Worker and The Humans Who Feed Us and others that really center the power of the community to drive change, as opposed to the media often focuses on the pain of the community and all the ways the community is harmed. And we've really focused our work, and the narrative that we're trying to make sure that people are hearing is around the power of the community to confront those circumstances, and also all the beautiful things that people have in their lives, and all the dreams that people have for their families, and all the joy that people still somehow manage to experience. I think it's related to what Victoria was saying, related to the resilience of the community. So a big part of our work has been focused there. And then the last, of course, is the direct services. And, a majority of my career has been focused as a litigator, bringing lawsuits and charges against bad actors when violations have occurred. I think, as Lupe has said, the goal really is to keep them from ever happening, to prevent these harms from ever occurring in the first place. I think that's what all of us here want. And that's what so many of our comrades in this movement want, is to just stop these violations from ever occurring. But the reality is, unfortunately, violations are still occurring and people are still experiencing problems. And so part of our work is helping to support survivors and other people whose rights have been violated to bring charges of discrimination and other kinds of complaints, and sometimes lawsuits, so that they can fight for the justice that they should receive, whatever that justice might be. For some people, they've chosen to fight it in court, their cases in court. Some people have decided that justice looks different for them. And whatever justice means for the community members, the migrant women and others who we serve, that is the justice that we help them to pursue.
Sorry, I was just wondering if I could mention another group doing really great work in North Carolina.
Yes, of course. Go ahead.
I just want to take a second to also mention the Western North Carolina Workers Center, because as everyone was talking, I was just thinking about them, and they also do such great work, and they're really close to my heart. And basically, that center is based in Western North Carolina, near kind of close to Asheville, in a town called Morganton. And it started decades ago because the primarily immigrant workforce at that local poultry plant was experiencing lots of issues in the workplace, many of which Lupe and Monica have named, especially the female workers who unfortunately were experiencing a lot of sexual harassment. But that was not the only problem, just general safety issues, line speed issues, extreme temperatures. The owners and the bosses and the supervisors just were not caring about the workers, lots of injuries, very severe injuries or chronic injuries, and in addition to just very regular verbal harassment and dismissal of issues and sexual harassment and lots of really awful things. And these workers actually came together and formed this worker center in order to better advocate for themselves and to push back and say that that behavior was not acceptable. And that worker center still exists to this day. They've kind of expanded to not just focusing on the poultry plant, but to also focusing on just like uplifting the general Hispanic workforce in that area, which I think is really awesome. And I just wanted to highlight them too, because I just love that example of workers not taking this like abuse. And yeah.
I love that. I think that leads in right to what I was about to ask, which from all of you, I love hearing that even though there's all these issues, there is a lot of solutions behind them and a lot of people working very hard to combat them. So I'm curious what keeps you inspired and what gives you hope for the future of the farm worker movement and even labor rights in general. I'll pose this question to all of you. So whoever wants to jump in first, feel free.
I can go. I have two things I'll talk about. The first thing that keeps me inspired is the students that SAF works with. So, we're Student Action with Farm Workers, or SAF for short, and we basically started in the 80s out of Duke University. These professors were doing this like internship program for students, and they started taking the students to migrant farm worker camps. It was a documentary professors, like art professors, photography professors, and they started taking students to basically document and photograph the conditions and workers at these camps. After some years, the students felt uncomfortable going to these camps and just taking pictures of it. While that was important for awareness raising and everything, taking pictures of the workers and not actually doing anything to help with the conditions they were witnessing, that they found really distressing. So they started actually trying to work with the workers to improve those conditions, for example, by like documenting worker stories so that they could share them in like legal avenues and things like that. And their work actually led to the creation of the Farm Worker Unit in North Carolina Legal Aid that still exists to this day. And they would, testify in front of OSHA, and they would provide services to the workers. And out of that internship came our summer internship, which still exists, and our organization, which is now a fully incorporated nonprofit and everything. And so our summer internship just started again this year. It starts in late May every year, ends in early August every year. And we take students from all over the country, young people from all over the country, from all these different backgrounds, but many are from farm worker families. And they come to North Carolina and South Carolina, and they work full-time with an organization that supports farm workers in some way, whether that be a union that organizes workers, or a health clinic that provides health services to workers, or a legal clinic, or migrant education, or something like that. And just every year, seeing all these students, many of whom, for like me, knew very little about farm work and were just getting involved because they were interested and passionate. And also lots of students who come from this background, many of whom have done farm work themselves, finding this community, sometimes several states away on a completely different coast, and learning about all of this organizing and participating in protests and providing services and information to workers is just amazing. And year after year, we fill a cohort of students with passionate young people who want to help and actually do help in tangible, real ways, and not just help by dropping it off, but help by empowering workers, empowering themselves. And every year, seeing this new cohort of students is so inspiring. And that's not our only program. but that's the program that I'm talking about today. And oh my gosh, I lost the other thing that's really inspiring. Oh, no, I remember. I recently attended Coalition of Immokalee Workers hosted this big action in Florida some months ago. I think it was in April or March. And it was, you know, supporting the Boycott Wendy's campaign and just being on the streets of this extremely luxurious Florida rich town, like rich, like we're passing Gucci stores and like all of these crazy luxury cars are driving by with all of these workers and all of these worker rights advocates who flew in to protest the conditions and say that these corporations need to pay attention to us, that we are making waves, that we're not cooperating, that we're boycotting, that we're doing all of this. Being in that space was also so inspiring because it's like, wow, there's so many people here, so many of whom were workers themselves who, again, were saying that this behavior is unacceptable and we're not just going to quietly take it and we're going to push back until we get justice. So that was also really inspiring. And I just cannot, I'm sorry to fangirl over Coalition of Immokalee Workers, but really I am a fangirl. So thank you, Lupe, for all the work that you do.
I agree with all of that. Monica or Lupe, anybody want to jump in? Keep the fangirling going.
I mean, I defer to Lupe, right? Because Lupe is the expert here. And so I want to give Lupe as much space as possible.
Gracias. Pues igual creo que mi inspiración es de los mismos trabajadores, ¿no? De los mismos que están dispuestos a ir a las marchas, que están dispuestos a seguir alzando la voz y que ese miedo, como dije anteriormente, se perdió. Eso es una inspiración para mí, para seguir luchando por los derechos humanos. Y pues sí, como estaba diciendo Victoria, las marchas donde vienen miles de consumidores, donde vienen estudiantes, el ver que no estamos solos, el ver de que los trabajadores tenemos una voz importante, pero también que hay apoyo para nuestras voces. Creo que eso es algo muy bonito y obviamente el programa, ¿no? Que está expandiendo y que sí ha traído cambios a los trabajadores y que hay testimonios de los mismos trabajadores de lo que han vivido, cómo ha cambiado. Eso es una inspiración para mí y para muchos en la coalición. Y creo que algo muy bonito con el programa es que cuando vamos a los ranchos, porque hacemos sesiones de educación de trabajador a trabajador, ya no se escucha tanto el que las mujeres están enfrentando acoso sexual, ya no se escucha tanto de que hay discriminación, ya no se escucha tanto de que ya están robados sus salarios, sino ya son otras preguntas, ¿no? Que, es que en esta vivienda me hace falta esto, ¿cómo puedo hacer? Entonces, son cosas que a uno pues dice, pues yo trabajé tantos años en la labor, cuando yo iba a poder preguntar si podían arreglar una cama en mi vivienda, cuando yo iba a preguntar si podía hablar con el señor encargado del rancho para que escuchara lo que yo estoy diciendo. O sea, que son cambios que uno jamás pensaría, que al principio era más como un sueño, como una ilusión de que esos cambios pasaran, pero que ahora estamos viviendo día a día y que los mismos trabajadores lo están viviendo. Entonces creo que eso es algo que ayuda a inspirar, ¿verdad? Porque sabemos que con cada corporación que venga, el programa tiene más fuerza, tiene más poder y eso es poder para los trabajadores, eso es poder para las mujeres. Entonces eso es una inspiración también.
Thank you, Lupe. Monica, would you like to close us out with the inspiration that you have?
Sure. I mean, first, I want to give a lot of love to the women who are part of our committee here. We have an advisory committee. They are basically a part of our board, and they inform our work. They make sure that we're staying on track. All of them are current or former migrant community members. Many of them traveled for years along the migrant stream. And I just they inspire me. They give me a lot of hope. And most importantly, they keep us grounded. They make sure that the work is really on course and that we are being led by community, that we aren't just deciding what the priorities are. So I want to give them a big shout out. But the other thing that is really inspiring to me, even in this conversation, is that there are many farm worker organizations across the country. We are just a few of them. FLAC is actually here in Ohio too, and have known their work and admire their work for a long time. But there are many of us, and it is inspiring to me that we are lifting each other up, that we are celebrating the work that all of our organizations that we're working alongside are doing, because that's important, right? We are not in competition with one another. The problems that we're trying to solve are bigger than any one of us or any one of our organizations. And it is really important that we continue to talk about the fantastic work that the coalition is doing, and the incredible work that SAF is doing, and the work that all of our other organizations across the movement are doing, because the work is difficult, and it is work that has been long-standing work. The issues have been long-standing problems, and it's work that will go on for years. And so I hope that we continue to see that we are celebrating and lifting each other up and each other's organizations, because it's going to take all of us to get across the finish line. So I'm here for all of that, and I'm here. I hope that I'm here for all of you, and really grateful for the opportunity to talk about these issues.
Thank you. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have today, but thank you so much for this incredible, truly incredible conversation. Thank you, Monica, Victoria, Lupe, for being here with me today. Now I'm going to pass things over to Univision's Carolina Sarasa.
Hello, everyone. I'm Carolina Sarasa. I'm one of the anchors for Univision, for Edición Digital, and also for our streaming platform for VIX. And every day in our newscast, we talk about workers, Hispanic workers, and especially the ones that work in farms. According to the last census, approximately 2.4 million people in the U.S. work in our farms. And from those, approximately 40% are undocumented. These are the people that have the lowest pay in the U.S., per the information that we have received. They also lack water, conditions living conditions. It is sometimes very hard for them, especially because of their undocumented status. So I'm so glad we're having the opportunity to talk about this event called the 19th in Conversation, Gender Equity in Farmwork. It is great to talk to two women who are also fighting every single day to make sure that men, women, and even minors that are working in our farms have those rights respected. One of them, Judge Laura Safer Espinosa. She's currently the director for Fair Food Standards. She's joining us after a very long trip, and thank you so much for your time, Judge. And also Elvia Gonzalez. She is the client manager for Equitable Food Initiative. To both of you ladies, thank you so much for your time, and I am so glad we're talking about this. Sometimes whenever we interview those people, they feel abandoned, neglected. So I want to start with you, Judge. What is the condition like for those workers in the U.S. right now?
Well, farm workers traditionally in the U.S. have been among the most vulnerable workers in our food supply chain. Unfortunately, they are excluded from many legal protections that cover other workers. And that is why it is critically important that programs like the Fair Food Program exist to help to protect and guarantee the human rights of the men and women who harvest the food that we all eat.
Now, Elvia, you were mentioning that you were a farm worker yourself a lot of years ago, and I have to say, congratulations. Thank you for everything you're doing. It is admirable to see somebody that was working as a farm worker to now be fighting for those people. Has anything changed between the time that you were working in the farms to now?
Yeah, there's definitely been improvements in some of the conditions because organizations that have done some great work and have created some change. To be able to improve some of the conditions. And I did grow up in states like the Midwest, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois. So I could, speak on that, about those regions, because I know it varies by region. California is a huge growing region. Florida is another huge growing region. But from my experience, I have seen improvements from, growing up, moving from South Texas, going up to Michigan. There's definitely improvements, and in my current position now, I get to visit some growing regions, and there has been some improvement amongst some companies that a lot of opportunities still, but still, there has been improvement.
Yeah, you talk about improvements, and I'm so glad to hear that, but there's also a lot to be done, especially now we are having this conversation because there's things that need to be changed to make sure that those people, especially the most vulnerable, women, people from the community, the LGBTQ plus community, even minors that work in these farms. And this question goes to both of you. Accountability. How do we make sure that these farm workers, that their rights are really being respected? Judge, you were a judge for more than 20 years. How do you make sure, and how do we make sure that these people really are getting paid what they need? They're not being discriminated?
Thank you so much for that question. It is the key question, because while there are some legal protections, although not enough on the books, enforcement and compliance has always been the problem. And we have a very good relationships with our friends at the Department of Labor, and they openly acknowledge that it is very difficult given resources and priorities to get out to all of the farms where the most vulnerable workers are laboring to put the food on all of our tables. And so really, it is remarkable that only a year and a half ago, a massive indictment was brought because of forced labor conditions in southern Georgia. Your listeners can all read about the Blooming Onion case. This is not an isolated incident. Forced labor, sexual assault, wage theft, systemic wage theft, health and safety violations, all of this outside of some initiatives like my colleague and co-panelist just mentioned. Outside of those initiatives, it is a very difficult world for agricultural workers, and they have very little recourse and a big bureaucracy to navigate if they try to get access to remedy. I know from being a judge that if you bring a court case or an administrative proceeding, that can take years or in the best case, months. And in the meantime, you are possibly subjected to retaliation. So what we really need to do is to hold employers accountable through the things that matter to them, which is access to market and market-based enforcement of human rights. And that together with legal enforcement from our colleagues at DOL, OSHA, and other agencies make a very effective combination that needs to grow and be promoted.
And I imagine a lot of these workers, most of them don't even speak the language. A lot of them are undocumented. We mentioned that nearly 40% of them are undocumented, and they fear talking to somebody from the government. We always on our newscast mention that they have rights, that they can talk to the Department of Labor regardless of their status. But I understand their fear. If they call to say that they didn't get paid or that they're having horrible living conditions, first of all, they're concerned that they could lose their job, and second, that they'll be deported. How is that situation affecting the farm workers, Elvia? And I wanted to ask you this question because you have seen firsthand how difficult it is for these people. They have nothing in their countries. They come here to get a better living, and now they're seeing themselves in these horrible conditions as well.
You know, there's organizations, you know, EFI, one of our missions is to bring farm workers, growers, retailers, consumers together through a certification program. And that certification program has to meet rigorous standards. And some of those standards include a program that's called a leadership team, leadership team training. And that brings an aspect into the workplace where it creates and helps build communication skills amongst employees, and all employees must be represented within the organization so that employees that are picking, packing, harvesting have a voice within their organization. And, you know, part of our certification program is creating that leadership team that gets trained to help and educate those employees that have that, you know, ideas that, oh, I can't speak up, I can't. No, there is ways that you can speak up. You are able to do it. And so that's part of our leadership team training that brings together that communication and empowers, the employees to be able to speak up. So I think that's some of the work that's being done to help. And that, because yes, it is very true where, a lot of times employees feel, they can't come up to their supervisor, they can't come up to their leads while they're working. But part of what EFI does through that leadership team training is help create and alleviate some of that so that people feel comfortable and everyone's represented within the company.
Speak up. That is a great message for all the people that are watching. It could be farm workers or anyone. Nobody deserves to have their rights violated. And Judge, how difficult is it? You have the experience as a judge for more than 20 years in New York. How difficult is it for a farm worker to be able to go to court? Because there's so many occupational challenges. For example, pesticide exposure, respiratory issues, vision problems, and all of these people. We have received so many letters from these farm workers. Me as a journalist, I've received 20, 30 letters from people that work either in farms or in these meat packing companies, and they say that the conditions are horrible, but they're fearful and they don't know that they could go to court and actually win a case. Is it possible for somebody to win a case?
It is always possible to win a case going through the legal system, but quite frankly, the ideal is for workers to have an expedited, confidential system of complaint resolution where they are completely protected from retaliation. And the Coalition of Immokalee Workers has won now 14 agreements with major brands at the top of the food supply chain that commit them to purchasing preferentially from farms that are certified by the Fair Food Standards Council to be respecting workers' human rights. And they also agreed to cut off purchases when farms lose those certifications. In addition, they pay a premium for their products that is passed along through the supply chain and shows up in the workers' paychecks as a bonus. That is important too, because when workers bring a complaint, they are afraid of how will they feed their families? What happens if they are fired? There's no cushion. What the Fair Food Program is able to do through a system of comprehensive audits and a 24/7 complaint resolution mechanism is that any worker, no matter what their language, no matter what their gender, no matter where they are working, can pick on a Fair Food Program certified farm. They can pick up that phone, make a confidential complaint about so many of the conditions that you are talking about, and have immediate access to an investigator who will investigate and help to resolve that complaint. And the reason that the growers collaborate with that process is because of the market-based enforcement. If they do not cooperate, they will not be able to sell. We resolve 65% of our complaints in just over 2 weeks. We resolve 80% of the complaints in under a month. I know from my former career that is like lightning speed, and it makes all the difference. We just need the program to grow with the help of consumers and listeners like your listeners.
And how transparent is this process? I'm thinking about from the perspective of a consumer, somebody as a mom that goes to the supermarket every week or every 3 or 4 days. Is there a way for the consumer, for the regular consumer to know, Elvia Judge, if a farm that we're buying from has a good rating or not? Or maybe we could even go online and check if they've had complaints, so us as consumers cannot continue to contribute to this horrible problem of workers being exploited?
EFI, we have our certification. Once a farm is certified, we have a marketing team that works with them, and they're able to have our EFI label on their product. And so you're able to find that as a consumer, responsibly grown farm worker assured label on the product.
Oh, that's great to know, EFI. So for somebody that's watching this program, it will be great to know that if you find the EFI label in your product, then you know that somebody like Elvia is watching and looking over your interests and the interests of the workers. Now let's talk about the pay. as when we started this program, we mentioned that these people get paid very low, but there's women and there's people from the LGBTQ community and even children that get paid even less. What is the condition like for those people, Judge?
They are among the most vulnerable. And we do get very heartbreaking calls from workers outside the Fair Food Program, and we refer them to government agencies so that their claims can be processed. But on Fair Food Program farms, there is complete protection against discrimination, against wage theft. We review the grower's entire payroll before they are approved for each year's annual audit. And we ensure that workers are getting the wages that they are legally entitled to, no matter what their gender, no matter what their sexual orientation, no matter what their racial origin. And consumers can also look for the Fair Food Program label in their stores and be assured that those workers are getting what they deserve and what they have earned rightfully in their wages. They can also check the Fair Food Program website.
And now let's talk about something else, climate change. How is climate change affecting the farms right now? Not only the farms, the things that we consume, but also the workers. Just a couple of days ago, we saw how many people were working there in Texas, where Elvia is at, or in California with those very hot temperatures. It's even impossible to go outside for 5 minutes. I can only imagine those people in farms working for 5-10 hours a day under those very hot conditions. So Elvia, how is climate change affecting the workers in particular?
I mean, it's definitely an impact, and just education, farm worker education, to be able to make sure that farms, growers are aware of what you could do when you're out there working in the heat. And unfortunately, I know some people feel like, unfortunately, they don't have other options. But again, going back to part of that awareness, creating the awareness that you feeling comfortable going up to your employer, and then the employer being aware of the conditions and what the different health organizations recommend. And so, for example, I was on a farm where in Washington State area, where if it's above 80 degrees, farm workers have to go home. So that's, there's some things that are happening, but again, other times it's agriculture, it's produce, and it has to be harvested. It's produced, and it's difficult, but there are some responsible farms out there that are creating some of those standards for themselves and for their workers. Again, a lot of room for opportunity, but there's definitely some good progress there.
Can I just add, it is a very critical subject, as Elvia is flagging. Farm workers are 20 times more likely to suffer the dramatic impacts of heat stress than your average occupation and any other occupation in the US. And there have been fatalities, there have been very severe cases of heat stress illness, and that is only continuing to advance as we see rising temperatures and heat index. And for that reason, 2 seasons ago, the Fair Food Program implemented mandatory heat stress prevention and response protocols, and it includes mandatory rest breaks for all harvesting workers between the months of April 15th to November 15th, which is a huge stretch. And the mandatory breaks, as I'm sure Elvia can testify, are key to people when they're working in the fields, because if you're working piece rate and people tell you, oh, you have the right to take a break, well, you can't, because your whole crew is advancing, and so then you're going to earn less than everyone. So the whole team has to stop every 2 hours, and that makes a critical difference. There must be water. Many of our farms provide an electrolyte option as well for workers, and beyond that, supervisors are trained and held accountable and responsible to monitor their crews for symptoms of heat stress, especially for new workers who are acclimatizing. And when they see those symptoms, they're held accountable to respond appropriately according to OSHA recommendations. So it is the education, which is farm-wide supervisors and all levels of supervisors, as well as each crew of workers. But beyond that, are mandatory standards that are rigorously enforced on our farms, and workers have the right to pick up that phone or to speak to an auditor or investigator if the protocols are not being followed. And so far, it's been very effective in reducing the cases of heat stress.
And I am so glad to hear that. It's not only the farm workers, also the construction workers, a lot of people that work in our streets, they see the impacts of the climate change and they see the impacts of this very hot weather. Then we see them all the time where they are outside, they're just exhausted because of the very hot conditions. And we are talking about farm workers. Me as a Hispanic, as somebody that works at Univision and that talks about these stories every single day, when I think about farm workers, I always think about our people, Hispanics. How dependent are we on the migrant workforce here in the United States, Elvia?
Very, very dependent. And so, one thing personally, with my background, I have a degree in food industry management from Michigan State University. I was able to attend the university through a migrant program. My college is a migrant program. And that, just opened my eyes to having that focus in where things come from, and especially food. And I focused on produce. So I just went back to the produce world and, just continued working there. And it's a passion of mine to be able to share with others, know where your food's coming from, how it gets here, how it's harvested, how it's picked, how it's transported. There's so much within the supply chain that happens. And I'm very passionate about that. And, as a joke with my friends, everybody knows I'm going to say a fun fact about a strawberry, avocado, or something I worked out before, tomatoes. And then it's just like, and then I'll get them with that. But then I'll also get them like, hey, this is how it got here. And this is the realities of the people that pick this, that pack this. And so for me, going back to some of the different growing regions, I have a very unique opportunity. And I feel very blessed to be able to go and visit different farms throughout the United States and Mexico and talk to the workers themselves that have been, they're so eager to show off. I've been here 15 years. I have been doing this. I was in that position. I started picking. Now I'm a supervisor. I love hearing those stories, just because everyone's so passionate. And what people don't realize is, look at who's picking and packing and working this. It's people with 15, 20 years of experience that only can tell you they have 15, 20 years of experience and have no credentials for it. And that's one thing that EFI we're trying to do. We're trying to credential some of these workers, because I have a degree and I could say, oh, here's my bachelor's degree. Maybe you have some type of certificate, but farm workers, they can only tell you, I've been working here for 20 years and I know how to work this line and pick that and pack that. But there's really nothing out there, and they're in the shadows. So we, farm workers, migrant workers, we're key to making sure that, we continue feeding the country.
They are in the shadows, but they're so important to our community. And I really hope everybody can have a conversation tonight with their kids about the importance of every single thing we have at the table. And we could just see your eyes, your smile when you talk about them and how proud you are. And I'm very proud of you. And hopefully one day I get to interview you in our newscast, but also Judge, you have a Hispanic last name. Let me ask you, why did you get into this field after being a judge for 20 years?
Well, the situation of farm workers is something that I knew about as a very young person, and actually worked in farm worker rights as a young person before I even became an attorney. And so it was, as you may know or may not, if I'm definitely the oldest person on this call, but the cause of farm workers and an alliance that was built between consumers and farm workers dates way back in this country to the 60s and 70s. And so it was not foreign to me. What I was disagreeably surprised to see was that all these years later, the area of Florida that I eventually resided in was known as ground zero for modern day slavery because of all the forced labor cases that surfaced. And I was very happy, on the other hand, to find that there was a program that was doing something about it. And I would just say, in closing, to the consumer, that it is all of our responsibility to ensure that the people who are at the bottom of the food supply chain, as Elvia was saying, who do put the food on our table, are protected, have their human rights respected. And you can do that by demanding that your food be certified by the Fair Food Program. And so workers know that they can enforce their rights. They're not asking to please respect their rights. They are armed with the ability to actually have those rights enforced through consumer-backed market enforcement on those farms. And that makes all the difference. It's the difference between vulnerability and dignity. And that is what we want for everyone.
So there's also the concern about sexual harassment. Women have reported that they have been victims of sexual harassment at their workplace. What is being done, Judge and Elvia, to make sure that that doesn't happen again and that no man, women is a victim of that problem?
It is a critical problem, and 80% of women who are interviewed on farms state that they have been the victims of sexual harassment and or sexual assault. It is extremely common and horrendous. So on Fair Food Program farms, you have a code that was based on workers' priorities and experiences. So therefore, sexual harassment is prohibited. But beyond that, sexual harassment with physical contact is of any kind is a zero tolerance violation. And a supervisor who does commit unwanted touching is subject to immediate termination in order for the farm to keep its good standing in the program. So workers are educated on those rights before they ever set foot in the field, through a booklet, through a video, and through interactive sessions with the education team, in which no matter what the literacy level, no matter what the language, drawings are used, theater, skits are used to let workers know and supervisors know that it is a new day, that women's dignity must be respected, and that there are consequences for if business as usual continues, with meaning that women are continually sexually harassed, there will be consequences for them.
And how do we monitor this, Elvia? How do we make sure that these supervisors are really aware that if something gets to their attention, they need to take action?
Right. So through the EFI program, in the rigorous standards we have also some mandatory sexual harassment training, and that happens with again, going back to the leadership team training and everyone getting trained in making sure that people are comfortable coming to those members of the leadership team. And part of that is making sure there's a representation, both gender representation, the percentage of women, men in an organization or in a company are represented well, and then each layer, within, from harvesters to pesticide applicators to management, everyone gets trained, and we provide resources for that as well.
And I would just add that standards without enforcement are really meaningless. So the fact that workers can pick up the phone and call 24/7 if there is sexual harassment, if there is physical contact during the sexual harassment, if there are unwanted remarks, stalking, any of the things that make up sexual harassment, they have at their disposal in their languages a 24/7 complaint resolution mechanism. And our annual reports publish the statistics on the sexual harassment complaints that we have resolved and how conditions have improved on Fair Food Program farms. And our only hope is that that will continue to grow and spread. We are now in 10 states, 11 crops, and growing internationally as well. So that is the hope, and that is the hope for a better tomorrow.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for everything you do every single day. And I'm sure that those 2.4 million farm workers or more in the United States are very grateful for the things that you do every single day to make sure their rights are respected, they get the pay they need, the water they deserve to drink, and the conditions they deserve to be working in the U.S. Judge Laura Safer Espinosa, thank you so much for your time. Elvia Gonzalez, also a pleasure to talk to both of you. You guys are welcome in our show anytime. Thank you so much for everything you do. And this was a great conversation, the 19th in Conversation, Gender Equity in Farm Work. Ladies, thanks again. I am so happy I get the opportunity to talk to both of you.
We'd like to thank all of our speakers for sharing their thoughts and experiences. And thanks again to our partner, Univision. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. We'll see you next time.